All right, and welcome back to another episode of Who's Lifting Today. I am here with Dana Monsees. We're going to be talking about weight neutral training. There's a lot of misconceptions that exist for weight neutral training and coaching. There's a lot of interesting comments that we get online about our coaching as well. We're going to talking a little bit about that and also like why this is the route that you should go in the future. But Dana, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here and kind of, bust some myths about this space because I think there's a lot of misinformation going around.
Yes, lots of misconceptions that we're definitely going to be talking about. But first, tell us like what you're all about, what you do, and then we can kind of dive into like maybe some of the comments that we've gotten in the past.
Yeah, so my name's Dana Monsees. I'm a dietitian, nutritionist, and body image coach. And I also have been coaching swimming and for, let's see, 12 years now, I think 13 years or something like that. So I work with a lot of athletes. And then in my private practice, I also work with a lot of people who deal with burnout and gut issues, which happens to a lot of people who are gym goers or athletes. And honestly, a lot of that comes from the training atmosphere, which is a lot of like the, earning and burning and like you have to go hard all the time if you want to
Right.
achieve a certain body type or, whatever. So, yeah, I take a weight neutral and weight inclusive approach to things, which is very different from a lot of the other trainers and dietitians out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And what makes your so talking about like your weight neutral services, what do you do that's different from maybe the people who are focused on weight or would be like more weight centric?
Yeah, so the biggest difference is I don't offer weight loss plans.
Okay.
So and there's many reasons why I do that. But so what it looks like in clinical practice is what the kind of ironic thing is a lot of people who even if they're weight centered or weight neutral, right? Weight inclusive care, which basically just means I'm going to help you work on whatever you want to work on regardless of what weight you are. Like there's no, discriminatory care here. There's no assumptions of oh, you're healthy because you're X size, or oh, you can do this because you're X size or you're not X size. Like, I don't make
Right.
assumptions based on what people look like, which sounds kind of bad to the people that are in the weight centric space, but in reality, that kind of is what their training is, right? It's the assumption is if someone is in a larger body, that they're unhealthy and that's why they're overweight, basically.
Hmm.
And I don't make that assumption. And so the way that that looks in practice is if someone comes to me and they have a goal of, I want to reduce pain, for example, from my knee surgery or from rheumatoid arthritis or whatever it is, instead of me saying, okay, well, we're going to work towards weight loss as a cure to your pain. We're actually just going to use nutrition and lifestyle modifications to directly target the pain instead of taking this roundabout way of, oh, well, first you have to lose weight and that's going to fix all your problems. Because for most people, it really doesn't.
Right. And so kind of you're just saying that you're just focused more on like the behaviors as opposed to like the weight on the scale. That's like the big difference. And
Yes.
also like someone comes into your office, they're 300 pounds. You don't assume that that person is healthy or unhealthy based on like the fact that they're 300 pounds. Is that like fair to say?
That's correct. And I'm not going to change their treatment plan just because of their size.
Gotcha. Okay, that's awesome. And like, I pretty much do the same thing. I don't do before and after photos. I don't do progress pictures. I don't do weight on the scale or like guarantee a certain look. I kind of always say that like training might change how you look, but how it changes is probably not up to you. And also, like, it might not change, but that doesn't mean that you're not becoming stronger. You're not becoming healthier. So that's a good thing that I think that you like really mentioned there. Now, I would love to get into because I get a lot of super fun comments about my style of training. And I would love to hear, like, you've been in the online space for a while now. Like, what are some of the, let's call them critiques about like the weight neutral space that like you've had in the past that you've had to address?
Yeah, so I don't get a lot of inflammatory comments anymore, which is actually really nice. The I would say because I'm in the nutrition space, right? And I did actually used to work in the let's say the elimination diets space, right?
Sure.
So when you get functional medicine training or functional nutrition training, instead of oh you have this condition, like here's this prescription, basically, which is the medical field. In the functional medicine field, it's oh, you have this problem, we're going to give you this elimination protocol and these supplements, basically, which is how I was taught. And that's how I practiced for a long time until I started to realize that that was problematic for a lot of the people that I was seeing, and it wasn't actually fixing people's symptoms. The symptoms first instead of just saying, here's this blanket list of yes, no foods, and you have to do this or it's not going to work, basically. And so when I switched over from that very elimination diet, all or nothing foods focused approach to this more weight neutral approach, people were like, oh my God, but you're promoting, obesity because you're promoting that people eat sugar and you're promoting blah, 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 all these processed foods and stuff. And I was like, first of all, that's not at all what I'm saying.
Right.
It's people really only will hear what they want to listen to. So
Right.
if for you, for example, if you say like, oh, I don't weigh people, I don't do before and after photos, the immediate gut reaction is, oh, you're promoting obesity. Oh, you're
Hmm.
promoting people being unhealthy. And it's like, no, if you would get your foot out of your own butt, you would be able to notice that we're most people, most clinicians, anyways, are going for the same goal to help their clients get healthier. If that is the client's goal, we may go about it different ways, but that doesn't mean that someone is promoting unhealthy behaviors just because they're not working on weight loss. Because
Right.
again,
Yeah.
it goes back to the assumption that losing weight is always healthier, and people
Hmm.
should always be trying to work on losing weight because that equals health. But if you look at the research, that's not actually true. You can pursue health without pursuing weight loss. And when you look at the long term mental, emotional, even physical effects of weight loss or weight cycling that more commonly happens with people that are dieting and then trying these exercise plans and then, quote, falling off the wagon, then going back on,
Right.
then going off. That can actually create more adverse health effects than just working on the behaviors alone, rather than just going to a trainer or a dietitian or whatever that's like, okay, we're going to, do this 1,200 calorie meal plan and you're going to do this 30-day workout challenge. And then afterwards, whatever, we're done working together. It's like, okay,
Hmm.
that's not helping anyone.
Yeah, I think that was the big tipping point for me because, like, back when I first started training, I was definitely like weight loss focused. I didn't come from this weight neutral perspective out of the gate for sure. This has been a transition, and for me, there was like two main things that really changed my mind. Was one, we're just really bad at weight loss interventions, like just by the numbers in terms of like diet, exercise routine. Like, really, we're just not good at guaranteeing constant weight loss, I think is the best way. Or is like actually losing the weight is not like necessarily the main issue. It's keeping it off. And that seems to be like the real challenge that we like don't have an answer to. And that was the first thing is like, okay, so like we're probably like over promising in terms of like what we can actually do. Is that like we have seen that people who have healthy behavior, they're eating like right within moderation, they're exercising, going for walks, managing stress, that like those people actually have pretty good health outcomes, like despite whatever they weigh. And I think that's like a super important thing is like we can improve people's health whether it shows on the scale or not. And I would rather focus on interventions that have been shown to be successful long term than like the idea that, well, if we just get you to a low enough body weight, that like you would just be healthy by default. And there's like lots of times where like that's not true. Like I think that there's lots of examples where like losing weight actually produces like negative health outcomes, and sometimes we celebrate that. I had a person on my podcast who was an ex bodybuilder, Christy Brown, and she was saying that like when she, when she was stage ready, like she was getting a ton of compliments. She was so lean and fit, and everyone was asking her questions about like what does she do to eat and like how can she be healthy like her. And like she was talking about like like my sex drive went, I felt miserable. She knew people in the industry who had like fertility problems later, and like these are all women who are like told all the time that like, oh my god, you're so like committed to the grind, that you're so healthy and all these kind of things. And that like there are reasons why like losing weight does not result in health. And I think like the point that you made as well is that like it's not that we don't care about health. If anything, it's almost like that's all we care about. We're like, we don't really care what you look like. We don't really care about the weight on the scale. Is that like the only thing we care about is like the healthy behaviors. And I think like that's the message that sometimes gets lost. And I kind of want to talk about that actually, because there are people in the space that I think are problematic to the cause, Maybe they mean well, maybe they don't. But before I share kind of like my examples, can you tell me about like people who have advocated that you think are doing it in like a poor way? Or if you don't have any examples, then we'll just jump right into mine because I have like a
Oh
whole
yeah,
bunch. But
I
yeah,
have examples.
okay, great.
um,
Absolutely. So talk about like how weight neutral people have been like talking about this and where it goes wrong, and then we can go from there. You don't have
yeah,
to name
so
names. You can decide. You can decide
yeah.
what route you want to go. Mhm.
No, I'm not going to name names. I don't want to, name drop anybody.
Yeah.
But if you look hard enough, you'll be able to find examples of who this kind of messaging, right? So I'll talk about this specifically from the nutrition space because that's what I have the most experience with. So there are a lot of people in the what's called the anti-diet community now,
Mhm.
which there's going to be extremes in any community or movement or anything, and this is just what that is, right? And
Mhm.
so the thing is, there are a lot of not all of them, but there are a lot of dietitians who basically the message that they're promoting is nutrition doesn't matter, just eat, whatever you feel like eating, which
Right.
is entirely wrong.
Yes.
Like there is nuance to be had in that conversation, but you can't have nuance on social media, right? So when the conversation happens, or when you're looking at these videos on TikTok or your own reels, or just looking at someone's Twitter quote post or something like that, the take home message for people who are new to this space, and a lot of people who have been in it for a long time, is nutrition doesn't matter, and all
Mhm.
nutrition science doesn't matter, because a lot of it is weight loss focused, and it was done on weight loss participants and everything like that. And while I agree with their reasoning that health is not determined by the number on the scale, I think they're going about it the wrong way, right? Yes, should we work on accepting ourselves no matter what size we are, and we shouldn't be determined, or like our value and worth in this world shouldn't be determined by our size or the number on the scale or anything like that. I 100% agree. However, like we're talking about, you can still use exercise, for example, or nutrition, or these other health promoting behaviors without this all or nothing lens, which is why people get so trapped in the diet mentality or the anti diet mentality, which puts a lot of people at a disadvantage, or kind of like floating in no man's land here. Because let's go through like the mentality of somebody who's been dieting for a really long time, they've been trying to get healthy, maybe they've been, pursuing weight loss, whatever it is. Maybe they have a chronic health condition, they're like, "Oh, I feel like I have to follow this protocol." And then they've realized that they've been weight cycling for a long time, their symptoms aren't actually getting better, and mentally, emotionally, they're like all over the place. They've got
Right.
all these fear foods and all this stuff. So they're like, "Wait a minute. I've been hearing about this anti-diet approach. Maybe this is a way that I can actually be healthier and feel better about myself and have a more peaceful relationship with food. Less stress overall equals less clinical symptoms, because there's less inflammation caused by the stress chemical cascade in the body," right?
Mhm.
I talk a lot about that in my private practice too. That's like, the nervous system is one of my favorite things, and I'm a big nerd. But so let's say they're going to try this anti diet space, and let's say they have a chronic health condition, because this is a lot of people that I work with, right? If you have a chronic health condition, that means that when you eat certain foods, your symptoms are aggravated. If you go to this anti diet space and they're like, "Oh, nutrition science doesn't matter, eat whatever you want." Again, I'm generalizing, not everybody here, but a lot of loud people in this space. Then you go, and when you come from the dieting mentality and you have a list of yes foods and a list of no foods, good and bad, whatever, of course, all of the foods that you're going to want to eat when you go to this anti diet space and you're working through this permission to eat all foods and everything, you're only going to eat the foods that you weren't allowed to eat when you were dieting.
Mhm.
So you're going to be eating, whatever it is based on the protocol that you were on. It's probably going to include sugars and lots of carbohydrates, and then maybe cheese, or maybe, potatoes, nightshades, like all these different, buzzword elimination food categories. If for whatever reason your body doesn't do well eating some or any of those foods, you're absolutely going to feel like crap when you're eating everything. But the kicker here is, in order to actually have a sustainable, peaceful relationship with food, you have to neutralize all foods and get rid of all of this noise, whether it's from the dieting side or the anti dieting side, all of the external noise, so you can tune in and listen to what your body tells you feels good and doesn't feel good.
Mhm.
Now, you might find that there are certain foods that you thought you weren't allowed to have before that actually feel totally fine. And then you might find out that there are certain foods that you were experimenting with when you're trying to figure out, okay, can I eat all these foods? Does nutrition not really matter? You might realize that there are certain foods that don't feel good when you eat them. But neither of those means that you're failing at
No,
this,
of course not. Yeah.
non-dieting thing. But that is where the problem is, right? Because then people feel like, oh, but I feel like crap when I eat everything. And like, if I throw away all of these, healthy things that I learned about food and I'm just eating like cookies and bonbons all day, like, I feel really bad. Like, is this, but it feels like that's what you have to do in order to be accepted into this, anti diet community.
Mhm.
So then these people feel really estranged by kind of both sides. And they're like, well, I felt better when I was dieting. So then they go back and we lose them and they go back to dieting and they go back to weight loss because you're hearing from all sides except the anti diet space that this is the way to feel better. And for some people, it does work short term, but then long term is where, again, we run into issues. And so that's why I think it's really important, especially from, both of us as nutritionists, personal trainer, we've got to get people to a place where it's realizing you don't have to be at either of these extremes. And actually, if you do truly want that long term health, it's in the middle, which is
Yeah.
really hard. And that's where having a coach or a personal trainer or a dietitian nutritionist, anything like that, who's well versed in these topics comes in. But all that to say, I used to get a lot of hate from both this community and then these people over here of like, the diet community was like, oh my God, you're promoting people eating all of these things. How can you do that as a dietitian? Whatever. And then this other side is like, wait a minute, you're telling people that it's okay if they don't eat certain foods? Like, you're not anti diet enough. So I'm very much in the middle.
Yes, and I've kind of noticed that myself where the anti-diet space, or at least a lot of people in the anti-diet space, like really do kind of like gatekeep the community. This is not everyone, of course. So if you're listening and you're an anti-diet person,
Disclaimers.
I'm not specifically talking about you necessarily, but like I have definitely had experiences where like if you are not 100% in line with the messaging, then you're kind of the enemy. And I think like that's problematic because as people, we are nuanced and don't really fit into like hard categories. I have been told myself that I am part of diet culture because I still focus on a number, that number being the weight on the bar. So that I've been told I'm diet culture because I have focused on objective goals. So like someone getting their first pull up or someone like deadlifting their body weight, like things like that. I think we need to be aware that the anti-diet people are still relatively new as well, is that like it is going to be unlikely that people are going to 100% align with your goals, especially as like a new community, and that unfortunately a lot of the messaging has been pretty anti-scientific, which I think makes it very easy to debunk. Whereas like when people say like, well, health at every size people or body positivity people are not like evidence-based. And the answer to that is like, yeah, sometimes, which is like unfortunate because like there is like evidence that exists there. There is research that exists. But there are advocates who don't go that route. The one thing I'll add as well that I've noticed is there's kind of two aspects to this kind of space. Is one is like the evidence behind being healthy without focusing on the weight on the scale, which I think is what you and I focus on primarily. And the second one is that there's kind of like a social justice intersectional component to the movement. Now, I don't think I like almost never go political on this page. But what I think is unfortunate is that like I don't know if the masses are ready for that conversation. And actually, by bringing that conversation out, it might deter people from the movement. So, like an example of this would be like people online have talked about like, well, the BMI is racist, okay, and there's like actually is like some stories and like evidence behind that. But if you go to a person who's not part of this space and like thinks the BMI is fine. And then you go, not only is the BMI not fine, it's racist. You're going to be like, what are you talking about? Like, it's just too many steps forward at the same time. And then, like, I've seen this online. I've seen people like, they'll stitch videos on TikTok. And if you ever want hate, like absolutely just check the comment section of a TikTok video. Like that's personal experience. On Instagram, I get told a lot that like people really like my message and they like my approach to training. And I go on TikTok and I'm like, wow, you're so dumb. Do you even lift? Like, what do you like? None of the stuff you're making is even sense. Why are you trying to make people fat? Like, it's a totally different world. Um, but I think like those things do matter, and like fat phobia exists, and that those are things that like should be addressed. But in terms of like the average population, every time that's brought up, the response is always like, "Oh, but obese people are unhealthy." And I think like that's kind of the battle we need to have right now, because the social justice stuff just seems super out of left field. It seems like, why are we making this political? We're just talking about health. And I just feel, as of right now, and feel free to like correct me if you think that I'm wrong or you have like a different approach to this, but like I've always found when that comes up, that like it totally throws off the conversation, and then no one listens to anybody, and then like it's just entirely like unproductive. I don't know if you have like a solution to make that productive, but I the health conversation I think is actually like relatively interesting, and like I've actually have persuaded people to look at health in a more weight neutral route. But in terms of like the political aspect of it, like that is totally just gone nowhere. Like, and every time I've seen that conversation come up, like it goes absolutely nowhere. So let me know if you have like solutions to that.
Yeah, so a couple of things. So one, I want to go back to when you said like, a lot of people, at least that are yelling on social media,
Yeah, the loudest.
are not rooted in science, or they refuse to use research, or they just don't talk about it, right? The most ironic thing there is the actual health at every size movement, which is a social justice movement. Is the health at every size book is like 400 pages, and half of it is research studies, right? So when people say that they're health at every size, but they're just like yelling about this stuff and kind of gatekeeping, it's like, well, you're not actually go back to the roots of your movement. It is based in science. The only way
Mhm.
that this actually works is if it is based in science, right? So because we can yell about like, oh, well, people deserve to be treated equally, like, yes, but if you go back to people's original bias of, oh, but they're obese and they're not healthy, it's like, okay, well, go to these studies from all of the researchers that have worked on health at every size stuff. There are people who have worked on these health promoting behaviors and achieved better health outcomes as observed through blood work and all of these other things without having to work on weight loss interventions, right? So kind of
Yeah,
going back
and
to the roots.
just to jump in really quickly, sorry to interrupt you, but like I also want to like be clear, is that I'm not saying like that stuff isn't real.
Oh no, I
To
agree.
like be totally clear, is that before I get super canceled, is that like I those things like are legitimate and are real, and like we have like reasons to talk about like fat phobia in society, like that's totally exists. I'm just saying that like the general population is like not ready for that conversation. You can
Hmm.
talk about it like within your community if you want, but that like the general person, like there where they stop at is like, well, if you're fat you're unhealthy. Like that's like the bar we need to cross first, and then like, and once they have that, like I actually think the rest of the stuff will be easier to advocate for. Like that's the, so sorry
Yeah.
to interrupt you, go ahead.
So I take like a multi-pronged approach, right? So if we're having a conversation or whatever, and they're like, oh, but that person's fat, so they're not healthy. And I'm like, then my question is, oh, how do you know that? Like, how do you know based on someone's body size that they're unhealthy? And then they tell you basically about all of their assumptions, right? And I'm
Right.
like, oh, okay. So we're assuming that someone is unhealthy based on their body size. That is actually rooted in institutionalized fat phobia and racism and all of these other things, right? So you kind of have to, as the person having that conversation, see where is this person on the receptivity scale of
Hmm.
things, right? Because if someone is yelling at you that, they're using like racist slurs and fat phobic slurs and all of these things, no matter what you say, it's not going to make a difference, right? And
No.
that's not a productive conversation for anyone. So in terms of the social justice movement and how I approach it, again, it really depends on the person that you are talking to. But so I think, as someone who has a public platform and like a place to talk about this space, what most people's ultimate aim is in the non-diet community, I would say, even the people that are anti-diet, which is ironic because we've been talking about all these people and how they kind of gatekeep, right?
Right.
Is we're trying to make a more inclusive non-discriminatory community, right?
Hmm.
And so obviously, like, race, gender, like, everything plays into that in terms of creating a safe space and education and everything like that. But you really have to take like a layered approach, right? Kind of like you said, if you just throw all of the isms on one person, they're going to be overwhelmed and just kind of be like, we're not talking about this, you know? um but I feel like you have to at least have a foundation of that and do some education, probably starting with your own clients and then maybe on a social media platform, at least throwing it in sometimes, right? Because there is also an aspect of, at this point, if you're not talking about it, like, silence is pretty loud, right? So there's a lot of the time when I'm looking for new people to follow in the non diet space, if they don't have anything at all on any of their platforms about like non discrimination, or, working again or working for these social justice issues, which I don't think are political issues because they're more civil rights and human rights issues, right? But I
Sure.
know a lot of people are like, this is like the common refrain, or like, why are you talking about politics when you're a nutritionist, right? And I'm like, actually, I used to work in politics, so I can tell you right now that I'm not talking about politics anymore. This is really just a social justice, like, equal rights issue, and what I'm trying to do here is to create a safe space for all of the people, which includes people in all body sizes, people of all races, all genders, all identities, all of the things, right?
Right.
What I do not tolerate is discrimination and hate, right? But we're kind of getting off topic here.
No, 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 you're doing great. Yeah, no, I think you're making a lot of really good points there. For those who are not on board yet or who disagree, what's the tip you would give them, or like how do you approach that first conversation? So someone who's come from like the diet culture world,
Mhm,
like they think the weight is like the most important thing, and like kind of like every intervention is to like lose weight.
mhm.
Um, if you want to persuade them to have a more weight neutral approach, what is the route that you like to take?
Yeah. So, on the one hand, I'll start with like the more extreme route, depending on the person, right?
Mhm,
If they think that a person in a smaller body or losing weight is always going to be healthier, then explain to me why people in low BMIs get cancer or diabetes or any of these other health conditions when they've been that size pretty much their entire life. And
mhm.
explain to me why people in larger bodies have longer lives than people in slower bodies, right? That's if you want to be a little bit confrontational, right? If you
Yeah, if
don't,
you want to like start a fight. I'm
yeah,
talking about the people who are coming in like good faith.
yes.
The
Um,
people who like actually, are willing to listen and
yeah.
not
So
call me
I,
dumb on TikTok. Like, who are those people? Yeah.
well, yeah. I mean, they're not going to listen to anything you say,
Yeah, they're
so
not even
let
worth
me just
addressing. They're not
let
even
them
worth
go.
having the conversation. Yeah.
But yeah, so I mean, I would say, well, there are many ways that we can work on health without having to pursue weight loss. Because a lot of the time, when you're looking at these weight loss prescriptions, a lot of the time it is an extreme caloric deficit and it's adding in a lot of unrealistic exercise. And those two combined for the long term, or basically as long as you can hold on until you fail, right?
Hmm.
So, what I like to work on with people is saying, well, instead of doing this very restrictive elimination diet where you can't eat yada, 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 and you can only eat this very small list of foods, what if we start by adding in, X food, which has shown to be really helpful for your health condition, for example? And they're like, oh, well, that makes sense, and then we start to add things in slowly, and surprise, the end result is something sustainable that they can actually stay with. Now, it's not going to be as quick as a 30-day, detox elimination, whatever, sugar-free thing. It's not going to be as quick as a 10-day juice cleanse or anything like that, which, by the way, I don't recommend either of those things, no matter what
Hard
situation you
no,
are in.
regardless of what you want. Yeah.
Right, regardless of what you want and no matter what extreme situation you're in, I don't recommend those. But my approach is, well, why can't we, instead of waiting on the weight loss to start working on these things, why can't we start working on these health goals now without
Hmm.
focusing on losing weight? Which for a lot of people doesn't work long term. Like 90, 95, I think, percent of people or
It
something.
depends what study you look at, but
Yeah,
it's high.
verified
Yeah.
more recent studies, not the ones that have been debunked, right?
Yeah.
um but starting with that, and then saying like, well, then maybe giving some research on how weight cycling can actually lead to more adverse health outcomes than actually working on just, behavior modifications and stuff like that. Because when you say losing weight, people are like, oh, automatically that's good. But if you say weight cycling, like gaining weight and losing weight and gaining weight and losing weight, most people agree that that is not healthy. So if we're talking about how very commonly like doing these extreme weight loss plans can lead to this weight cycling and these adverse health outcomes, which, we can talk about what those are. But they'll be like, oh, okay, this does make more sense. Now, the caveat here is if someone is looking for that extreme, I want to do this now, that approach is not going to work. But if someone is looking for that extreme, I want to do a, 3-month sugar detox or something, they're probably not going to be amenable to our type of work
Probably not.
anyways.
No. Yeah, you gotta pick your battles in that one. Of course, you gotta figure out and like yeah, that's basically the route that I've been going. Is like, listen, I'm not gonna ask for your weight. I'm just gonna focus on healthy behaviors. Like that's like and that actually gets a lot less criticism. Is that when
Hmm.
I tell people like, hey, I don't work on the weight on the scale, but I'm gonna make you stronger. I'm gonna
Hmm.
make you healthier. Like I focus on healthy behaviors still, and like that's I think been really really beneficial. And like that caveat is not talked about enough or discussed enough. A lot of people
Yeah.
just stop like, well, I don't care about your weight. But
Hmm.
then people have questions afterwards that like aren't solved. And I think that's where like a lot of the confusion comes in.
Yeah.
Where can people find you if they have more questions about like the weight neutral aspect, especially because like you work with like chronic conditions, like specifically from my understanding.
Yeah,
Um,
so I mostly work with people that have either chronic symptoms, like symptoms that won't go away, or have been diagnosed with a chronic health condition. So I work with people that mostly have some kind of like gut issues going on, whether it's an actual diagnosis or it's just feel like I've been bloated for my whole life and I don't know what's going on here. And then I also work with a lot of people that have adrenal issues and burnout. So if you want to find me on Instagram, it's my full name. So Dana Monsees _ CNS. And then my website is realfoodwithdana.com. And then my podcast is called Wholehearted Eating, which you can find all of those things if you just go to my website or my Instagram.
all right, Dana, listen, this was really helpful. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me for the nuanced discussion.
Yes. And thanks everyone else for listening to another episode of Who's Lifting Today.